fight. You take the wrong and you make it right. Like a firefly, you're glowing at night. So don't make it hard, don't let me go. I wanna hold you tight when you're cold. I'm waiting for your love, you just keep me hanging on. I deserve to stay, and I will find my way. I will find my way.
Everything changes.
Life.
fast one at the end of a black hole, cold, lost and upside down. Faces swirling past me, all my memories rolling vastly, cold, lost beneath the ground. All done by my own hand, I allow my feelings to become sand. Oh, if you're gonna cut me down, better do it quickly now, now. You can cut me down, but I won't stay for long. I'll grow back again, oh yeah, my roots are strong. This is not forever. Folks changing like the weather. Cold, wet, and all around. Toxic people being severed, like leaves falling in September. Cold, wet, and on the ground. You can cut me down, but I won't stay for long. I'll grow back again, oh yeah, my roots are strong.
We're going to get started in just a moment. If I can get everybody to have their seats and get comfortable, we'll get started.
Hey everyone, welcome. We're going to get started in a couple of moments, so please grab a seat. My name is Nick Van Wordenberg. I'm the founder and CEO of Rangle. We're a digital transformation and JavaScript design and development shop based in Toronto. We're about 250 people, and we've been working, applying lean startup principles to our work and continuous delivery principles to our work since we started 5 years ago. So I'm really excited to have Brett Durrett here, one of the pioneers in the Lean Startup. The company that he was CEO of is what Lean Startup was written about, a pioneer in DevOps, and really excited to have him here. So Brett's a serial entrepreneur. He has experience founding and running startups from $0 to $50 million. He's the former CEO of IMVU, Eric Ries's original Lean Startup, and currently a venture partner at Social Starts, the 5th most active early stage fund. So with that, I'm very pleased to welcome Brett to talk about the challenges of executing Lean Startup.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for coming. So I have to say, this is the first time I've actually been to a place where I'm speaking publicly where there's actually an open cocktail bar. And so we're not going to do it now, but at the end, I want to do a couple of Q&A. And anytime someone says MVP, everyone's going to have to take a shot. That's going to be the game we play. We're just going to see how long we can go with this tonight. Oh, this isn't going to work. So Nick actually stole my first slide, but a little bit of a background on me. Basically, I've always been into technology. As a little kid, anything that had screws and a cord on it, I pretty much took it apart and sometimes assembled it back together correctly. I got my start in video games. So the very first thing I ever worked on was a game called SimCity as a programmer on that. Got very lucky to be associated with a good product. All my life, I've done startups. And so I've never joined a company that's had more than about 6 people in it. A couple of those startups have grown over 150 people. A couple of those startups didn't do so well. And as Nick mentioned, most recently I was the CEO of IMVU. I started off there. Eric Ries actually hired me at that company. I hired Eric Ries at the previous company. And I started off in a technology role at that company, running VP of Ops. When Eric left, I took over for all of engineering. And then for the last 4 years, I ran the company as the CEO. One other interesting tidbit, I am Canadian. So even though I come from the United States, I officially become Canadian in like October. So I'm very, very excited about that. Last night I was talking to someone and he had mentioned that he had dug up my original slides from the Lean Startup, the very first Lean Startup thing that Eric Ries did. So it was a convention in San Francisco. And it was one of those things where at dinner I was horrified because I'm like, oh God, those were all text, all like it looked like just like giant cuts of text. It was so bad. So anyway, I dug through some of my old slides and I wanted to come up with some of the things I used to talk about, which was the first thing I ever talked about was continuous deployment. With the idea of this is like every time you check in code, it goes out live in front of customers. And these are the actual slides I used to talk about, which is, the way we build software at IMVU is we develop a feature, we increment it, it goes through like a verification, and then it's live in production. And at that time, it took us 15 minutes from someone to check in code to it being in front of, I think probably hundreds of thousands of customers at that point. Basically, there's no staging cluster, so there's no place for QA, and there was everything you did just went out live. And I would go talk to people at conferences saying like why this is so cool. And the general reaction I would get is, why in the hell would any company do that? And it wasn't until this book came out, The Lean Startup 2011, which people started to understand about a process that minimized the waste product, that you had an ability to iterate faster, that you could go through a loop that allowed you to learn more about your customer and whether you're building the right product. And so if nothing else, the book that Eric published made my slides in retrospect actually look like I wasn't completely insane. The Lean Startup methodology is one that's kind of built around this core loop of build, measure, and learn. And so you build a product, you do measurement about like what the impact was on your customer, and then you integrate that learning into the next cycle through that path, or the next path through that cycle. There's a goal about minimizing your time through this loop, because particularly as a startup, you have a limited amount of time, you have a limited amount of resources, and so the more times you can get through this loop and find out whether you actually have a product and a business, the better your chance of success. One of the things that you can go wrong in doing this is the emphasis on speed. And so I talk to a lot of companies who will, and particularly in a Silicon Valley sort of mentality of this fail fast, will focus on the speed at which they get through the loop without being really attentive to the fact that the important thing is actually getting the learning out of each iteration of the loop. And so I tend to remind people that like fail fast is actually not the goal. If you're going to fail fast is actually the best way to do it. But continue failing fast basically just means that you go out of business at some point. So your goal is actually to find the successful product. It's the number of times you go through that loop. One of the key things I also see that a criticism about Lean Startup is whether or not like it actually builds complete products, or whether you get sort of these products that feel more piecemeal. And one of the things I think was really missing from the book was a key role of a co-founder of IMVU, a guy named Will Harvey. And Will Harvey was a very strong product person, really understood like consumer products, built delightful experiences, and really had a great vision for what IMVU could be. The problem with having a great vision is like if you're right and you know how to build towards it, that's amazing. If you're wrong, then you can continue down a path for a very long time before usually it's the cold hard realities of going out of business let you know that you were not able to execute your vision. So the Lean Startup approach was largely overlaid on top of this and worked as a balance to make sure that, yes, let's work towards a vision for what we're trying to do, but at the same time, at each step of the way, let's make sure that we're actually building a business towards that vision. And so when I look at the best product design changes we made and the things that had the most impact and delivered the most revenue, they were all associated with things where we actually had a very strong vision about what we wanted to deliver to the customer. We still tested it. We still verified that we're on the right track, but it was not something that we said, we don't know, let's just ask our customers. So you'll never A/B test yourself to a vision. You need to have that vision when you're building. So the first step, the process build. How many people have heard the term MVP? Is everyone? Great, so everyone up here knows it too. So minimum viable product. Again, another thing that receives a lot of criticism. A lot of people have argued that the M is capital and the VP is sort of lowercase, where people build something that's minimal and it's not actually viable and it's not actually really a product. People have suggested, I think Jason Cohen suggested like the SLC, simple, lovable, and complete. I've also heard people say, it's better to build a minimum lovable product, but I think these are all basically ways of saying that people have used the MVP as an excuse for pushing out crap and not actually having a real product experience. And so rather than say we need a new acronym for this, I'd like to look at what is it about an MVP that's important to make sure that it's a valid MVP. So the first one is, does it deliver on your product's value proposition? And the best example of this is, so IMVU, for those that don't know, most people know that IMVU existed as a company, but most people don't know what IMVU actually does. IMVU is a social chat that's built around avatars. So people have avatars, they buy clothing, and they talk with each other. And as a business, the IMVU basically sells tokens for people to buy the clothing and stuff that other customers make for each other. So IMVU is kind of a business, as in the prints money that customers use to buy stuff. And that seems like it might be kind of a ridiculous, silly little thing, but the company does over $60 million a year in revenue at this point. So It's a lot of people buying cyber pants to trade. But when you talk about the value proposition that IMVU offers, it's really about create, share, and validate. So when you actually talk to customers, you understand that no one actually needs an avatar, no one actually needs cyber pants. What people need is this ability to very quickly do something that makes them feel like they have a creative expression and have other people give them the validation for that. And that was really the core of the value proposition of the company. And so IMVU had great success at certain times building on monetization features that really emphasize how do we get people to give us more money. But ultimately those were short-lived. And there was 2 times where we actually made changes to the product which were big. We are going to take several months to do a release, which was a huge thing for our company, because if something took more than 2 weeks, it never got done. I mean, we released everything within about 2 weeks. And these were times where we said, we understand what the customer wants, and we are going to build that, but we're going to build that in every couple of weeks, bring the customers in and get the feedback and sort of do the release. Those were always the most important. So we had a product where our very first attempt at mobile was called IMVU to Go. IMVU to Go allowed people to buy stuff, it allowed people to message back and forth, but it was all, like you could see like the clothing that you could buy, you could text, but when you talked to someone, it was just text. And this product did not do well at all. It was not, it never really got traction. It was like some people used it kind of as a utility. In contrast, the second version we built was IMVU Mobile. And in this case, we said, hey, IMVU is all about this like deep, rich 3D environments. You can see your avatars and stuff. We're not going to do that. What we are going to do is we're going to give a 2D representation of your avatar when you message with someone. And the important thing about that is it showed what you're wearing. What this did is it completed the value proposition. It allowed them to create where they could still dress up their avatar. They could express themselves when they communicated, someone saw what they're wearing, it definitely sent a statement. And they would get validation because people would often be like, oh my God, that's awesome. Where did you get that? How did you build that? That product today is driving all of the growth of the company. And it has since gone from like doing 2D to like 3D and such. But the very first thing, the very first MVP on that was a very basic. And if you compared it to what most of the customers were using, you would have said like, this is ridiculous. But it fulfilled the value proposition. The other thing is it a functional product? And this is a place where at IMVU we got things wrong a lot. The question is, without any additional work, is the product going to fulfill a need for your early adopters? And oftentimes people push out something and it's like we're testing a piece of functionality, but you actually can't really use it. It doesn't actually give a complete experience. A lot of people think that like you have to build a giant, like huge functional thing to actually do that, and that's also a wrong way to do it. Customers love like a simple solution. Like if you have something that does something that fulfills a need for a customer, like in a very simple way, it is actually probably satisfying the need of the MVP. And as a test, what I usually will ask people is like, can you imagine with the MVP that you released, 1 year from now, without doing anything else to it, can you imagine that the customers that are using it today are still using it because it solves a need for them? And if you can't do that, I'm going to argue that you're possibly not actually delivering enough of a functional product to actually test for an MVP. And one of the downsides at IMVU we had is we'd have a lot of features that we'd push out kind of in a half-done state, which is it kind of worked, but it didn't. And ultimately what this is like customers would sort of start using it and say like, hey, this is interesting, but we wouldn't get enough feedback to say it's really that interesting. And then you end up in this like this weird state as a company where you're like, some of my customers love it, some of my customers don't love it. It's not actually done. We're not going to put any resources against it. And so you really miss out on these opportunities to delight customers by actually giving them a full functional experience. And then finally, intentional learning. We go through a cycle, we push something out, and particularly as I talk to companies, as I do for like venture, I find out about people's first versions, and I ask them, well, like, what did you learn? And a lot of times we say, I'll hear feedback like, well, we learned it didn't work. All right, so great. Where do you go from that? Why didn't it work? What was it that you had expected to learn from the MVP? This isn't where it's important to understand that before you actually release something, or even before you start building it, is understanding what is it that you're going to get out of this at the end of it. It's either going to tell you that, hey, there's something that is moving us in the right way that's successful, and here's how we're going to assess that, or we're going to have the following information, and that's going to allow us to make a different set of decisions at the end of it. But be very aware of what those decisions are. And so if you're about to build an MVP, and at the end of it, you're going to say, I have data, and it's like you can't actually start talking about the different decisions that you would actually consider making based on the results of it. you need to do more upfront thinking. And this is going to be critical in some of the things I talk about on how you actually look at the data that you get. But if you're not doing that homework, it's likely that what you're going to be doing is pushing out stuff and just randomly figuring out whether it works or not. Another thing that kind of comes up a lot, particularly when people read about sort of some of the processes that IMVU was pioneering with continuous deployment and sort of the way that we worked, a lot of times in more technical conversations, people are like, well, do you have to do things this way? Or like, oh, yeah, we don't do things with this system, and I've been trying to get people in my company to do it this way. It's important to know that like Agile's a great tool that can be helpful and actually give structure around the development process. But IMVU actually worked in a way where every team kind of decided what was best for them. And we didn't really have a whole lot of rules around things other than like we do need, we had a culture of getting software out the door quickly and getting customer feedback. But we allowed each team to figure out, based on their delivery and who they're delivering to, what was going to be the best way for them to work. So different teams would actually use different tracking tools. And all of this actually seemed to work well because we wanted people to be able to solve the problems the best way they could for themselves. And I'd like to point out that like for people that are holding and saying, hey, there's a system and we can't change it, innovation is actually super critical. And all the systems that you're using today, all the best practices of how we do things, like DevOps, Agile and stuff, all those have come because someone looked at the previous best practices and said, this sucks, and done something different. And so, all of the things that are considered best practices today, I hope in 10 years that like people are looking back on them like, oh my God, I can't believe we used that. That was horrible, because we found much better ways of doing things, much better ways of delivering value to customers. One of the other things that's kind of important about this is, so IMVU is really focused on continuous delivery. So we always, when we commit code, it goes out to the customers. And our very first product was a PC client, so that basically people have to download an application. And so we had both the website component and the PC. But the customer experience was every time you logged into your PC client, which most customers would be 3, 4, 5 times a day, you were hit with this dialogue, a new version is available, please download. And then you'd have to download this big client, which is a horrible customer experience. And so as a company, we said like, hey, we're used to working this way where we can get our software out and we can get the validation and the testing and find defects super quickly. But it's such a horrible experience for our customers that we can't do this. So we had to change in how we built and say, well, we'll still build the client with everyone and it can go out theoretically in any single release. But we waited until we felt like the customers would tolerate another release, and then we push it out like once a week or once every other week and stuff like that, kind of depending on how tired they were getting. And then this wasn't always a choice, because at some point as we started doing mobile, continuous deployment pretty much hits a brick wall when you meet. Has anyone heard of a company called Apple? So, it's a little Bay Area company. They're super cool. Anyway, but you basically say, I'm going to go release software, and they're like, oh, great, that'll be anywhere between 24 hours and 2 weeks, and that's it. So if you basically have a system that's too rigorous around this and you can't adjust, it won't allow you to actually deal with like the things that come up that are actually more important for your business. Measurement, a lot of the things about lean startup and measurement, typically A/B split test, and then lots and lots and lots of metrics, but not vanity metrics. I mentioned earlier that like A/B testing is, you're not going to test your way to a vision. A/B testing is really good for delivering optimization when you want to make incremental improvements. And kind of the way, the example I use on this is, if you want to A/B test your way up a mountain, you can take 2 trails, and if you are at a higher point on one of the trails than the other, then okay, that's probably a good path to follow, and you can eventually get yourself up the mountain by following something like that. But the problem is, it misses the big picture. So it's very possible to get like local maxima, which is you've actually reached the most optimization you can, or you're actually not making many meaningful changes to your business anymore. You're really optimizing something that ultimately isn't going to be that good. So in this case, you've made it to the top of that mountain, but your A/B testing is never going to get you to that other mountain. And this is where I think it's very important that you understand as a company or as a product what your vision is. Because when you start looking and saying like we're getting more like smaller and smaller results in like the work that we're doing, it's time to step back and understand like, are there different approaches we can take? Is there a different direction that we should be taking in the product or the business? Otherwise, you'll grind your way into like optimizing away with no growth. Don't test anything. I love this, actually. I found this image and I was kind of like, why would anyone do that? And so it's kind of like a why would you do that, and then what the hell are you going to do if you find out that this is good, because you certainly can't tell your friends that this is good because they'll laugh at you. IMVU made it super easy, and we actually had a lot of companies that would like look at our systems and say, wow, this is amazing, we wish we had them. We made it super easy to test anything. So it literally took minutes to start another experiment. An engineer would check in code, a product manager could do it, and then look at the results. But the problem is, this easy to test everything, time is really precious, and you're gonna waste a lot of time on experiments. If the experiments are not going to be meaningful, if they're not gonna provide a meaningful difference or a decision point for your business, there's a lot of chance that the overhead in getting the experiment right is going to be very costly for you. And there's a great example. Google had a famous, the 40 Shades of Blue. Has anyone heard of this? So before 50 Shades of Gray, Google had 40 Shades of Blue. And what this was is user, like a UX designer or something, was working on one of the teams and ended up quitting because they were being forced to figure out what color they should use for the link color to get the best results. And they have a split test between 40 different variants to understand which shade of blue. A company like Google actually might be able to produce enough data where that actually makes sense, but in almost every other company, there's no way you're gonna get anything meaningful about that, and it's not actually a meaningful difference for you. And so always do the test, like what significant differences are we gonna, or what significant decisions will we make as the result of this experiment? And then on the learning, after you've done your building, your measuring, you end up with hopefully something that you can actually be actionable for the next customer iteration. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the experiments. So we built this system, and so at any time, like we had hundreds of experiments running because it was so easy. I want to test whether this pixel on the left side of the screen is better than the right side of the screen. It's so easy, so we're doing it. And we read this paper that came out, Controlled Experiments on the Web. And this was an amazing paper. This was 2008-ish timeframe. And basically really talked about all the methodologies that we were using for doing this, and we were ahead of the pack, and arguably like the gold standard in the web days for this. And then was feeling pretty good, and then I had one of those, what I like to call an oh shit moments, when in 2012, a paper from Microsoft and Amazon came out that was, it's 5 puzzling outcomes from web experiments. And the basis of this was, when I looked at it, these were experiments that were run over several months with PhDs, with people that were like the best of the best in setting up these experiments and doing them properly and having all the controls right. And they screwed up these experiments, and they produced the wrong results. And I realized at this point that we basically, when we brought on people in the company, we had pretty much a 10-minute A/B testing for dummies discussion, and then like set them free. And I realized at that point is where, hey, there's probably a lot of things that we're doing that we have a lot with it. The experiments are giving us false confidence. And this is where I started ratcheting down on the ability to actually start an experiment without having a lot of diligence around it. And this is also kind of goes into why I say that when you're doing experiments, you should realize they have a cost. A real experiment should be considered a project, because ultimately it will be. You really need to think about like all the people like that are going to be looking at the data, how they're going to interpret it. It becomes a lot more to get them right. It's very easy to get them wrong, but it's just really hard to get them right. So even then, now that you have all of your data and you're like, say, good, we've got a lot of clean experiments. The other thing that you need to fight is the cognitive biases. So these are things that as humans we are wired in ways that we will look at things and we will make irrational decisions that seem very, very rational to us. The heart of this, like that I see when you have a lot of data and you're looking at this, and particularly when you have people that have been invested in, I'm building a product and I want to show that the work that I did is valid, is we are pattern-loving machines. And so if I put out a feature and there's 50 metrics I can look at, I will undoubtedly be able to pick out 3 or 4 of those that I absolutely moved. With a 95% confidence ratio, of course, 1 in 20 of those are actually errors in the first place. So I'm going to have a couple of freebies in there for me. And so it's very, you have to be diligent again in looking at the data to make sure that you are only looking at very specifically the data that you said you were going to look at, and only qualifying it whether it was a success or failure based on the criteria that you established at the beginning when you were doing the experiment. Because if you're not doing it that way, I guarantee you, you're going to find success. And if the number of times that I've looked at we got a 10% lift here, a 12% lift here, a 3% lift here, an 8% lift here, and I added it up, and I'm like, revenue is down by 2%. So, all these things don't necessarily add up because a lot of times they're not actually the thing that you're moving. And we'd have even ridiculous things where someone would alter the checkout flow and then come and look, registration's gone up. And you're like, can you even craft a story that explains why checkout would affect a registration? One of the strongest things for this I suggest for companies is build a culture around actually being able to have discussions and push each other on the validity of the data and why do you think that, and actually push hard against this, because individuals will be drawn towards making the decisions that give them confirmation bias. I was talking to Mark last night about Texas sharpshooter, which the idea behind Texas sharpshooter is a guy goes and shoots at a barn and then he goes and draws a target around the cluster of bullets that he hit. It's look, I'm a Texas sharpshooter. That's exactly what happens when you have the pile of metrics. You get a bunch of craptastic decisions because people are oh, look at the results that I drove, even though that wasn't intentional. 5 whys. How many people are familiar with the 5 why system talked about? And so something that kind of comes out of Toyota manufacturing. The idea behind this is when you're trying to diagnose something that goes wrong, you ask why, and then you ask why to the answer of that. So if anyone's ever had a 3 or 4-year-old in the house, it's about the same thing about why. But in theory, what this is supposed to do is get you to the root cause. And so, the example is, in the Toyota manufacturing, Bob put the wrong bolt on the car, and it's why? And it's well, Bob didn't know that the bolt, that he was supposed to be grabbing bolts out of this bucket. Well, why? And it's well, training didn't actually address that the bolt bucket is on the left. And it's well, why? And it's well, training only covers the following things. And so eventually, supposedly, you get up to what the root cause is. The problem is systems are extremely complex. People, servers, the 5 why process. You're going to be bringing a lot of bias to what you think is a root cause, and there's really no root cause. That said, the root cause, going through the 5 why process, is actually really great at identifying a bunch of things that could have led to, or things that you could have changed to maybe have reduced the failure. And so, while I don't subscribe to the get to a true root cause of the 5 whys, I do say that it provides a very good method for saying, hey, we can change this, this, and this, and it is likely to eliminate failures that are in a similar vein in the future. So still a very good tool for doing that. The other downside of A/B testing is you're going to get a lot of feedback that basically tells you everything has a little bit of value. And so you're going to push out things that someone likes a little bit, or some customers love a little bit. But the problem with that is you're going to get that across everything. So the good stuff, the bad stuff. Occasionally you'll get things that really outperform and are obvious. But it's a very difficult thing, particularly in a startup where we went through this a lot, where we'd look at something and we're well, that's generating $20,000 a month, and geez, that's a couple of salaries. We can't turn that feature off. But the problem is, if you don't maintain this editorial view, you end up with a product that is a bucket of bolts. And that's exactly what the early versions of IMVU turned into, because there was a ton of things that just didn't really make sense. At one time, I believe we had 5 different messaging systems. So if you wanted to send a message to a friend, there was literally 5 different systems that you could do that, which is crazy insane. This is, so the editorial view is actually critically important to building a better product. You can't rely on the metrics to tell you that everything has value, because all of those things are generating some value, but as a whole, they're making a much worse product. And then if you happen to be doing consumer with enough customers, we know once we got to 1 million customers, it didn't matter what we changed, a bunch of people would be pissed off. And the quintessential example I use of this is one time our servers went down, so I gave everybody free credits. And there was a huge uproar in our forums because I didn't give enough credits, or people that use the service should have had more credits than people that don't use the service that much. And it was got it. If literally giving you money is going to make you unhappy, I realize that the good news is we have lots of passionate customers, and I love them. But as someone that's making these decisions, you have to balance that. When you're working with enterprise and such, when you're more of a one-on relationship, it's a little bit different. Consumer though, with millions of customers, there's always someone that's going to be fairly passionate on one side of an argument. And then actually, quick side note, how many people are building products right now or doing something where and how many people are actually going and talking to customers right now? Okay. I meet with a lot of companies. They'll be like, "Hey, we're doing this thing. We're lean," and I say, "Hey, tell me about some of your customer interviews." And they're like, "Oh, well, we collect these metrics and we send out these surveys." And I'm like, "Right, so tell me about the last customer you talked to." And it's like there may have been a couple of them, like when they were first getting the idea off the ground and stuff like that. I used to tell all employees to talk to customers. When I was running product teams at IMVU, I would mandate that people watched the user interaction test. And as we brought people in, almost every week at the company meeting when I was CEO, I shared a story about the person I talked to. A lot of times I would call someone and end up with a lovely story about like, "Oh, my husband is here. I met him on IMVU." Where it's like literally, it's like, wow, I feel like the most amazing thing about what I do is like sometimes I give someone a life partner. Like that's in a product that's kind of like a silly little chit chat product. Like it's an amazingly rewarding feeling. And so there's a lot of things that come from it. But the most important thing is customers will tell you things that are not the questions that you're asking. And the number of times I was sitting there and just talking with a customer and doing, "Oh, okay, yeah, you're doing that, okay, doing that." And I'd be like, "Wait, what? How are you using it? Like, wait, what type of group have you set up in here?" And I realized like there's all these use cases that you discover because I never would have asked that question. It never would have come out on a survey. And it was all incidental. Like the fact that I found it, I started creating a list of the marriages because I was like, this is really weird. There might be something here. There wasn't. But there was enough that I kept saying, like, it's really odd that I talk to people that have actually found a significant other on here. So customers are really terrible at telling you what they want. So a lot of times customers would be like, "You should build this feature." And you really want to steer people towards like, you need to understand like what delights customers, like what is it that's actually giving them the satisfaction. Customers are really good at expressing what they don't like, and you can understand their pain points. But this is where you actually have to have the vision and say, "I'm going to figure out the way to solve that problem, or I'm going to figure out a way to provide that delight for a customer." So you can't rely on them for like the details of like the feature you should build, but you can rely on them to like help you guide you and understand what it is that motivates them and what makes them happy. So get out of the building, talk to customers. Like people will say, "Hey, it's really hard to do this." No, it's not. Like I watched a Meetup. Actually, years ago, I met with people at Meetup, and they were so critical on customer interviews that they had a process that they were getting like 4 or 5 of them a day that they had optimized around like doing them all over Skype and everything. And so they were, they didn't have to bring people in the office. Everything was set up. Everyone could participate from their desk. But since they thought this was so important, they made the process so easy that it just like naturally happened. There was no overhead, so people did it. Talk to customers. And with that, I think that's everything I have for sort of like on the discussion of Lean Startup. I'd like to take any questions. We have 2 mics set up, I believe. So if anyone would like to. Okay, yes?
Hi. Great presentation. Thank you
you
so much. So I work at an enterprise. We work with pretty much every corporation in Canada. No joke. We work with everybody. It's a legacy business, though. And I speak with customers all the time. I'm a product manager. The way we've structured it, I sit with support and customer service management. We get tons of feedback. There are intractable issues that we'd like to solve. How do you move an enterprise faster, even without necessarily a full lean startup methodology or a full agile methodology, even though we got thousands of employees, we have hundreds of developers. A 2-week sprint time where actually something gets released, that would be amazing. I'd jump for joy.
So the question is, how do you affect change in an enterprise? I've watched like CEOs of like Fortune 500s be replaced with people that are brought in to like change the organization, and even that's a pretty massive struggle sometimes to actually have success. So doing it from within an organization is really hard because you're kind of changing it from the wrong direction. There's a lot of systems that get built into enterprise, particularly large companies, that are processes that are hard to get people to let go of. And I don't think there's like any one answer that's going to fit for one enterprise. Otherwise, everyone would be changing all their enterprises, and we'd be looking to enterprise companies for all the innovative ideas and stuff these days. Although I do encourage always like the entrepreneurial approach, though. So like you're working within there, and there's problems that you see. If you can figure out the sort of the scope of things that you actually can change, and then start looking at those and saying, great, here's everything that I actually have some scope over or influence over, and then actually running it like, think of it like a mini business plan or like a mini project plan, which is, I'm going to get someone what is your release cycle right now? Like
Every 2 weeks we release.
every 2 weeks you release, and you want to get down to so just say like, hey, my goal is to get us down to every 1 week or something. I don't know if that's actually one of your goals or whatever, but who are if you have within your scope of influence, like the people that you could get to do that, just start the project. Here's my objective. Here's how I'm going to measure it. It's going to be, once a week we're going to deliver. So what's my next goal? Okay, get either someone to agree with it, or let's see if we can get a release out a day early. Say, hey, there's a holiday coming up. Let's release a day early. And it's like, hey, look at that. We did it a day early. Wait, let's do that again. Let's try that again. Let's have and see, maybe that's the way to do it. But you have to start with what are the things that you can actually change. Changing a giant car, they're big ships. They're hard to turn around. They're harder to turn around when you're not actually at the helm. So, yes. Do you want a mic or do you want to?
So in my work, a lot of people use the business model canvas as part of the lean process, but they use the canvas only, and they've gotten rid of the business plan. So I'm wondering, are business plans a thing of the past? And I've heard a little bit about the lean business plan, but I don't know too much about it.
So are business plans a thing of the past? I would not say that's true. So I think there's, you're looking at someone, so Steve Blank pushing the business model canvas is I think trying to take another approach of how would you develop this, and I think it's again another framework that kind of works for people to think about it. The whole point of so Steve Blank used to be on our board. He gave us a lot of advice as a company. And the basic thing is that Steve used to say is well, business plans are bullshit. None of them ever survive contact with a customer, and that's true. And I particularly now in sort of that is true for most things where there's a lot of uncertainty, like in startups and stuff. There's other types of businesses where you have a lot of data and information, and you can actually make much better predictions. But startups are inherently trying to do something which is solve an unknown. You're either trying to find a way to do something way more effectively than everyone else so that you've actually stolen a business, or you're trying to do something that no one's ever done. And so whenever you hear well, here's what it's going to look like 4 and 5 years out, you're just kind of well, where did those numbers come from? I mean, you've got assumption multiplied by assumption multiplied by another assumption, and any one of those numbers has any variance in it, it's just completely wacky. And so I think there's the recognition that what you want is how you're going to track progress to something. And so my experience more recently talking to seed startups has been very interesting, because now that I've looked at 100 companies that are sort of sharing some form of a business plan, it's amazing how quickly I discount all the numbers that were provided. And then I have the interesting perspective of a lot of times getting an update 6 months later and saying yeah, none of that was true. And then I'll see the business plan with everything was well, multiply that by 0.6, and all the graphs do this now and stuff. And so I'm not faulting the company for that. It's just that I think there's a lot less sort of weight put on how well can you predict this. There are aspects though that to cover about talking about how big could this market be, because there's a lot of things where it's well, where do you see this going? And again, having a vision for turning into something big. If you're doing VC funding, if you're not creating a company that's at least going to get sold for $100 million, you're going to be hard to get anyone's attention. And 100 million is a really low number to get the attention. So you need to have like how does this going to fit, and have something that's like a tangible, like here's kind of like the way that works. But I wouldn't call it a plan. I'd kind of call it a interesting story that could fit and may make you rich. So, yeah. Please. So the question is using the A/B testing. I mentioned that like not to deviate from the criteria that you set at the beginning for the test. So and is there possible that there's other data that is valuable? It is possible. I think what we did have cases where we, particularly early on when we did open kimono and started all the metrics, where we'd say like, that's interesting, let's go do another test to kind of validate that and such. The problem with that is the more metrics you have and the more things that you look at, you're going to get false positives. And so, let's just say if you're running 100 different types, or if you have 100 metrics that you track, 5 of those are going to be telling you that like, congratulations, they're statistically significant results. So now if you start tracking those, like going after those, like you're going to kind of go down that path. So it's really hard to know what you should look at. There's a guy named Evan Miller who used to work for us who actually wrote a blog post about, because we were doing A/B, the other thing we were doing about A/B testing is we had a thing where you could check at any point to see if you'd reach significance, and which is a complete no-no. You should never, ever, ever do that. You have to have a fixed size data set, and then you can only you basically get one look at it. And the reason for that is everything will basically become statistically significant eventually, pretty much. So if you have something that stops too early, you're going to be getting wrong results. So there's all these things that like you may discover something, but I really think that you're way more likely to be led down the wrong path as you're like grabbing for what looked like it was actually meaningful. We really do love patterns, and we really do. We love between the pattern matching, the confirmation bias, like we want to understand that the product that we just like spent like 70-hour weeks building is doing something amazing. And when we see that one little thing, we're like, oh, that's it. So it's hard. Other questions?
You said talking to the customer is important, right? So before talking to the customer, do we need to have some kind of MVP or POCs to be done, or just have an idea to talk about?
So the question is, do you need to have an MVP before you talk to a customer? No, not at all. In fact, I would strongly suggest that you talk to customers before you have your MVP. If you're a CEO or a strong product leader, like this should be something that you just get extremely comfortable with of talking to customers and trying to figure out how to listen and understand what their pain points are and such. And the other thing I'd really say is interesting, because I was talking to someone about doing customer interviews, and the feedback was, oh, well, I really don't have that much time. I've got a limited amount of time to focus on this product. They're kind of bootstrapping it and doing it kind of in part-time. And my comment was, like, the people that you're talking to, they're going to probably save you time, because you're going to get a lot of feedback that you're like, oh, I didn't know that. Like, I don't know how you know what product to build if you aren't getting any guidance from your customer. You may have an idea, but like, there's a lot of things that you would have built that I think you would have gotten feedback that said, like, don't do that. But the other thing, like, particularly like your early customers that you are doing these interviews for, you have like a really strong opportunity to have these be your early adopters and your evangelizers early on. And so when you're talking to someone and you say, hey, here's the problem I'm trying to solve. Like, what do you think about this? Like, and then you end up a lot in some customers like with a relationship, and then you reach back out to them a couple months later and saying, hey, like your feedback was really helpful. Does this solve? Like, does this really address your need? This is a really strong bond when a customer has a feeling that a company is actually building for them. So like IMVU's early adopters, like I mean, they were really, really passionate about like the relationship that they had, because all of our employees were talking to them on a regular basis, and they'd be like things like, oh, I can't see my credit balance here, and like 10 minutes later they'd be like, wait, it's on the website now, and it's like, yeah, we it was a simple fix. We just put it in there real quickly so you could see it. They feel very, very strongly attached. I mean, much more than our later customers were, because our later customers were just some big, corporate entity and stuff. But the early adopters, look at those as an opportunity to like be not just interviews, but like your first penny. So, I'm going to go back here first.
Hi. We talked a little bit about deliberate learning, and we understand that the metrics that we want to capture are built around understanding what we want to learn, right? Is there a framework for figuring out what exactly you want to learn, as opposed to just, oh, is it underused or is it not underused? Like anything more than that?
I think in products, there's usually two things, like what's completely broken and like what's hurting us and like what are the big opportunities are generally where I ended up looking for like areas of focus, because if you're working in a company that you have more resources than you do ideas to work on, wow. We're always like, we can go after about 10% of what we can do. So like, let's make sure we're going after the meaningful things. Those were generally like pretty, like you're looking at the business metrics and like, well, what's hurting us as a business? So churn rate is high. So like, we're noticing that our revenue drops off at a certain point from a customer lifetime or whatever. When you're looking at the business metrics, I guess at least from a more established business, you can kind of look at the areas and say like, hey, here's where either we're losing or like it looks like we could be doing a lot better. And then the metrics kind of naturally flow out of that. So if you're trying to figure out churn, clearly, what's the last day a person logs into your service or not. Earlier on, I think most customer acquisition and problems that you're going to solve are going to turn into a funnel, which is, someone's going to find out about you, someone's going to come to you, someone's going to either convert or not convert, someone's going to either become paying or not paying. That applies generically to almost any type of business, including sales and consulting and stuff like that. And in all of those you can look at that and you're saying like, wow, I went out and I talked to 1,000 people last week and 2 people called me back. Those 2 people bought my service and those 2 people paid me. It's like, yeah, you need to fix that first part of your funnel. Like because if you can get like 2 more people, if you can basically get a 1% improvement on the top of your funnel, you're going to like double your business instantly. So those things kind of pop out. So it's depending on your business, what's important to like, where's your opportunity? What's the next step to success? Does that kind of help? Okay. I'll go you first and then you.
So my question is, so we mostly that you like every 2 weeks new features, right?
Mm-hmm.
But how do you gather all the data? You interview the people, all the data within 2 weeks in order to get to know what the end user wants to. So like, are they okay with the functionality within 2 weeks?
So let me make sure I restate the question. So you release every 2 weeks and you're wondering how you get the data so that you know for your next sprints that you're actually making the right changes. I don't think you can in most cases. Like, you can't, assuming that your team is, your push is on Friday and then on Monday your team's coming back to work. I guess one answer is you could have a astoundingly weekend of hammering through customer interviews. But I think largely you have to like look at this as like parallelizing what your releases are. So ideally not having sort of critical junctures. So if you can stagger like what you're building so that there's things that take longer to build out, or there's things that have been more solidified from previous sprints about what you're building and let those continue, while the testing is going on in parallel and let that influence things. And then sometimes you just have to have the flexibility that you may have to make a change. Like, if you're moving fast, sometimes it's better to like kind of go forward in one direction and have if you have a team that's sort of accepting that like, we may get data that tells us that we need to go in a different direction, that can be frustrating. But if you can get people around the fact that like, that's how you do development, because that allows us to actually, both be very productive in the amount of stuff that we get out and actually adapt to the customer feedback. So those are kind of some of the techniques that I would think about. But we usually had to like come back to stuff sometimes and say like, this worked, this didn't work. And a lot of times, getting the data would take weeks, and sometimes months for some of the things that we did. Like it was a small use thing. How do you define the amount of people to interview? I mean, it feels like a gut feeling. Like, I mean, there's a point at which, like, I think you start hearing, like, for me, like, I'd start hearing like common themes and like really get to. It was very much a transition where I could actually describe what a customer felt, like what their experience was, and really the nuances of like each step along their journey as a customer, and then also know kind of like the variations and the outliers. And that took years to really kind of get to that point. And I'd say like that was probably like I have enough to like actually feel super confident, but I still did customer interviews every week because, you know, even though I wasn't making product decisions as the CEO, I was like, what are my customers experiencing? So I'd say there's never a time to stop it, but you also can't, you can't say like I have to do 1,000. I mean, at some point you have to make a decision to move forward on things, and you have to go with the best information you have. So, hopefully it'll come to you where you're like, wow, I really actually feel like I get this at this point.
When you talk to your initial customers, is there a concern that your requirements are driven by like the early adopters rather than the early majority of the
So the question is when you're talking to your early adopter or the early customers, is there a concern that your design is being driven by those early adopters? I guess I wouldn't describe it as a concern. I mean, I think I've kind of thought of things of like, your first job as a company is to survive. I mean, like, you have a limited amount of time to actually get customers, and so I was telling a story earlier, and the way IMVU was built is the very first version of it, with this like let's do this really quickly, it was a separate 3D window that didn't have a messaging system underneath it. It would use your instant messenger, like AOL or Microsoft or whatever, to do all the communication. And we're like, well, this is a product where you talk to your friends. And I think Eric actually speaks to this in the book. But we would have customers come in and do like a play test where we'd be like, okay, like, here's what this is. And they're like, oh, that sounds cool. And we're like, okay, now invite your friends to chat. And they're like, all right. And they'd be like, yeah, I'd rather like, talk to someone else, not one of my friends. And our first reaction was like, God, wrong customer, go get us a different customer in here. And then we would do these tests and we'd be like, what is wrong with these customers? What are they? Oh! And then we realized it's like, wait a minute, like we had a product that we thought the customers wanted and we had a way that we wanted to use it. And that product would have put us out of business. And our customers, what they wanted to do was talk to new people using it. And there was a deeper complexity about this, which is, as a user experience, you get in there, you're trying something new, and the very first thing you're saying is make your friend do this with you, and you have no idea what it is. So people are like sketchy about doing that. But the point was we had to fundamentally change who we thought was our customer and adapt to it. That was our early adopter, but that drove the business. Had we been rigorous about like, well, here's what do we want? Well, we want every man, woman, and child on the planet using this every day for buying their groceries, and that wasn't our product. It would have been ideal. I mean, being Amazon would have been a wonderful thing, but it wasn't who we were, and that's not what our customers wanted. So I would say if you have early adopters that are passionate and are going to direct your customer and are going to actually become customers, start with that. Like you can cross the chasm later. But getting to the point where you're having to deal with crossing the chasm, good problem to have. Most companies don't get there. So.
Was there something specifically for your customer side that really pulled you forward? Was there an inflection point or something that happened, or social media event or something?
Yeah, so the question is, was there something that happened that actually really propelled the business at any one time? Is that correct? So it's interesting. Early on, the growth happened when we actually put in effectively like a MySpace-like networking functions where it was very easy to see all the people that had visited you and talked to you and stuff like that, because it allowed for a discovery of new people to meet that just was a naturally good, it was a very naturally fun way to do it. So even the process of actually finding someone else to talk to was really fun. Like because everyone built like pages with like very graphic with lots of cool stuff on it. So like wandering through that was actually a delightful experience in itself. So that's what initially drove the growth, because now people, when they logged in, they would actually would get to the most critical thing, which is I found someone to interact with that actually gives me a validation loop. What later, but that only got us to a certain level. The next thing that drove us was actually looking at the piece of crap product that we had built by putting all these nuts and bolts on it, and realizing that we would watch people come in the top of the funnel, and because we had built everything piecemeal and like get it out this week and get it out this week, you would watch people use it, and sometimes they'd have like 20 or 30 windows that had popped up by the time they'd do something. Because like if you wanted to buy a piece of clothing, it would take you to the website. But then if you wanted to chat, it would take you back to the client. But then if you like wanted to like edit your friend list, it would take you back to the website. And each of those was a new window. And so you'd watch these like the playtest and stuff, and it was just a disaster. And you're just like going, oh God. Like you're just wondering whether the poor little Windows 95 machine was gonna just collapse under the load. And so that was the first time that we actually said, look, we know what customers need. They're confused. They can't get around. And so we spent 9 months, and this was where a big part of the team worked with a lot more design over on user experience, and like we really had like an idea about where we wanted to go. We were testing it every week by bringing people in and like having them run through tests on this, and we had some number of customers that had access to it. The other thing that was very exciting, it's not really in the lean startup story or whatever, IMVU was just about to go out of business. So this was 2008. We had been doing very well in growth. I think we'd grown to like 9 or 10 million a year in revenue at that point. But then we were spending a lot more than that. And then for anyone that remembers 2008, this is when the capital markets completely dried up. There was no chance in raising money. The advertising market, so everyone that was advertising based went out of business. A lot of Silicon Valley darlings disappeared overnight. It was any company that was not able to be self-sustaining was in trouble. So we had about 9 months of money in the bank at that time. And we launched the client, and our customers hated it. So we got, again, the forums lit up. This is the worst thing ever. Why would you change this? Why didn't you fix this bug instead? Blah, 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 blah. And our revenue started climbing. And the reason for that was a fewfold. The lesson I've talked about with passionate customers that they're upset, but the fact that they're upset and they're telling you they're upset is actually probably a better sign than the fact that they're silent. But all of these customers had grown accustomed. They had crawled across a football field of glass. They've gone over barbed wire, and they had mastered this complex, problematic product. And then we gave them something different that actually fulfilled the roles. But what happened is every new customer that came in, our conversion rates went way, way up. People knew how to use the product. They could very quickly. So that was the thing that drove the next largest growth in the company. And that actually propelled us substantially for several years. So I'd say that was probably the single biggest change that like drove growth in the company. Other than 2.5 years ago, the mobile was the next thing. And the mobile product that we eventually delivered was also done very much kind of in the same way, with a very strong vision about where we're going to go. If you look at it compared to IMVU's old products, much more polished, a lot more design, a lot more product management around how we built that one. Still, again, validating along the way, but it was, I think, recognizing that what people expect out of a product experience has changed. Yes? Weren't we supposed to do the taking a shot when we did set MVP? Wasn't that something?
Promise I won't say MVP. So, yeah, I have a couple of questions, couple of interesting questions, hopefully. I work for a hardware startup, well, in growth phase, and we produce physical units, which are expensive to produce. Do you have any real-life examples of people iterating and doing A/B testing on physical products?
On physical products, I can't think of company names, but I have actually talked to people that were, for physical products, using effectively prototypes and like 3D printing techniques and stuff like that to very quickly get the prototype stage out and doing sort of testing with people and such. With hardware, like I had a friend that was, a friend of mine's a CTO for Arista, and we're talking about this, and building switches is kind of a harder approach. So you're limited on certain components that were, you have a manufacture time and like there's really not a whole lot you can do on that. There's other aspects of like, well, how far can you go before you manufacture and kind of do the testing? Like, are there any prototypes that you can kind of get out there or something? So I don't have a whole lot of strong examples when it comes to like real sort of big hardware manufacturing. Although I believe, if I remember correctly, in like one of the Lean Startup conferences, like someone had done some talk about this, but it's not an area I follow quite as much.
Okay, great, thank you.
Sure.
Second question is about the bias you mentioned around A/B testing. So for the physical products, the hardware that we sell, all the traffic comes through our e-commerce website. So recently we did an A/B test of a new homepage to see if it has higher conversion rates. So interesting thing was one day one homepage had 30% higher conversion rate, and the next day the other homepage would have 30% higher conversion rate. But overall, the original homepage was 10% higher. Obviously, statistics is the truth. But I believe there is always a way. So I kept on looking at the data to understand what type of demographics came into this website what was the deciding factor between one day one homepage is doing better and the other one, or the other day the other one is doing. Because 30% conversion rate is very high.
Mm.
So far, I haven't been able to see anything in the data. So I'm thinking I need to gather more data by installing extra, trackers or whatever else. In your experience, do you know what could have caused this spike on different days of people preferring different homepage for the conversions?
Yeah, this is a kind of a great one where, like, I would say, like, if you were to do a 5 why on it, you're never going to get to a root cause, probably. Yeah. So we did a lot of web. Was this something like as a paid traffic acquisition type of thing? Like,
it's both paid and.
So I do have a lot of experience with this, actually. Yeah, so we have found working with everything from like we were finding ad fraud, so click fraud. So depending on where you're buying your traffic, there's a lot of people around the world that can actually do very well through fraudulent networks and click fraud. So we have seen that be a driver of a lot of traffic. Depending on like where your stuff is showing, like how your ad's being purchased, is if it's being optimized by like through Google one way or another, and where it's showing.
Mostly on Facebook.
Okay, so it's on Facebook. So I don't know if you actually track to like when the ad has been shown, and like whether or not they're actually testing their algorithms, because they may have been like, hey, it's not performing, and so it hit a threshold and cut off one day, and then like another day it did something, and they're routing a different type of traffic. Until you, I mean, unfortunately, I think until you actually start like trying to get as close to like tracking the sources down and stuff like that, it's a lot of work. I mean, because we would sometimes, IMVU spent a decent amount of money, and so we would see $5,000-$10,000 to campaigns going, and say like why does that campaign, like it seems to perform extremely well getting people here and like zero conversion, and then find out that whoops, like this was completely fraud, that there was a network. We even would like, one of the things I would do sometimes is I would find ads for IMVU running places, and I'd be like, who ran this ad? Like it was like everything was wrong about like our image and like all that stuff, and I'd be like, it was like literally a completely different network that was using it and then routing it through some other thing to like cause acquisition to happen and stuff. So unfortunately, there's a lot of incentives for things, and there's a lot of systems that like you may not have access to. That you're right, instrumentation may actually help you get that, but like it's going to be, it's likely to be a pretty long haul to kind of get that right. I wouldn't be surprised if actually there's, I think there might be consulting services that are actually good at helping establish that.
I'm just wondering, maybe it's just my own bias. So, okay.
I mean, yeah, it's different. Like there was like, we would see all sorts of weird surges in traffic and various things that like, what is this? Is this the World Cup going on? Did someone, get things, and things that we thought would drive traffic, like, who was it? Who was it? Was it Snoop Dogg? I think mentioned us on Conan O'Brien, and we're like, that's going to drive traffic. That did nothing. There was something else where like someone did a story about 2 people getting married in France, and supposedly that drove a bunch of traffic. Although after that was largely people trying to say, oh, that was our work that did that. And I'm like, maybe, I don't know. It's really, it takes a lot to actually figure out, particularly if you're pulling in a lot of traffic, all the variances in it. Any other questions? There's free drinks. So, all right, should I turn it over to Nick? All right. Yep. Thank you very much, everyone. It's been an honor.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks, Brett. So thanks, everyone, for coming. Please feel free to get another drink. There's lots of food there, so feel free to get some more food. Wrangle's hiring, so if you're interested in doing the kind of work that applies lean startup at scale, please check out our website, Rangle.io. And yeah, I look forward to if anyone has any questions about Rangle or Brett, any questions for Brett, or again, the food and the drinks, please hang around for a bit. Thanks, everyone.